Welcome to Asia Society. My name is Richard Holbrook, and I'm the chairman of this great institution. And we have a really very interesting discussion today, and I'm so glad to see so many of you turn out in the middle of August for it. Mike Chinoy is currently at the Pacific Council on International Policy in Los Angeles, but he's certainly more familiar to all of you as a 24-year veteran of CNN who reported from Asia through some of the most dramatic events in recent Asian history, going back to and including the great drama at Tiananmen Square and many other things. I've known Mike for some years and admire him and think he's one of the outstanding reporters who covered the area. Mike's book is why we're here today, and I will let him speak about it himself. It's been reviewed by Glenn Kessler, an outstanding State Department correspondent of the Washington Post, who called it a tour de force. I've just started it, and the parts I've read certainly support that. The subject he's talking about is one of the few semi-successes of the Bush administration. And I say semi because they began with, I'm speaking for myself, Mike can comment on it himself. It began with a tremendous mistake by the Bush administration, in my view, a repudiation of what they'd inherited at a point when the North Koreans did not have nuclear weapons. And it ended up with Ambassador Hill, Chris Hill, negotiating the agreement, which is the subject of most of the book. And it's a very good agreement considering where Chris Hill started. But I will leave it to you to decide whether we're in a better position today or a worse position than we were 8 years ago, and I look forward to hearing Mike's views on that. Mike will be interviewed in a conversational style by one of the newest members of the Asia Society family, John Delury, who is the new associate director of the Center on U.S. China Relations, working closely with Orville Schell, who is the director, and with Vishaka and myself and Jamie Metzel. John's an expert on Chinese history, has been teaching at Brown University, and got his Ph.D. from Yale University, which I assume means Jonathan Spence, the great Jonathan Spence.
That makes two of us.
You also? Two Spenceites. And he himself has written a book, an article called Harmonious in China, The Ancient Sources of Modern Doctrine, which appeared in the April-May issue of Policy Review. So, Mike, welcome to Asia Society. We're delighted to have you. The book is on sale outside. John will personally, and Mike will personally inscribe it in English, Chinese, or any other language you want afterwards, and I urge you to add it to your bookshelf and spread the word, and it will be, of course, on sale at our bookstore downstairs. So without any further ado, I want to turn it over to John Delury and ask you to begin the discussion with Mike. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Ambassador Holbrook, for those introductions. We're very excited to have you, Mike, to talk about your book, Meltdown. We thought maybe we could start off on a more personal basis. We'll get into all the diplomacy and high politics soon, but since, for the average American, your record of 14 trips to Pyongyang accounts pretty high up there. We thought we could start with a little bit also of the history going back to the early 90s, and then sort of how the book, emerged out of those personal experiences.
Okay. Thanks very much, and thanks to all of you for coming in the middle of the summer when you probably have better things to do, like getting a tan. In April of 1994, I had lunch with Kim Il-sung in Pyongyang. One of the more memorable moments of my journalistic career. I had gone into North Korea on a trip that we had managed to get ourselves invited to, courtesy of the Moonies, who had been asked to organize a delegation of so-called VIPs for his 82nd birthday. And Kim hosted this small group, which included a few journalists who'd been allowed to come along, at the Kumsung Palace in Pyongyang. And it was an amazing 90-minute experience in which he held forth on all sorts of issues, ranging from the nuclear issue, talked about how he didn't want to have a confrontation with the United States, talked about what a good son Kim Jong-Il was, talked about how he liked to hunt bears, but he was getting old, and so his soldiers would go out and put a bear in a tree and give him a gun, and he'd go off and shoot it. And then at one point he stood up to give a toast. And as he did, it seemed that there was this kind of rosy glow that filled the room, and then as he sat down, it sort of dissipated. And as we left the lunch, my cameraman, who notices such things, turned to me and he said, "Did you notice the lights?" And I said, "No." And apparently, my cameraman had noticed that the point where the wall meets the ceiling, tiny little lights had been cranked up as he stood up to create this rosy halo effect. Then when he sat down, the lights were turned down. And for me, I thought that was a perfect expression of the difficulties of trying to figure out North Korea, because you're never sure what's real and what's not. And that has been the kind of central challenge that I felt from my first trip in 1989 to the trips I made throughout the 1990s, including accompanying the Reverend Billy Graham in 1992 and being the only journalist to accompany former President Carter in 1994, when Carter used CNN to announce agreements that he had reached with Kim Il-sung, which forced the Clinton administration into accepting some modifications in its own position that it didn't want to accept, which helped diffuse the first nuclear crisis, and in my view, I think played a major role in preventing a new Korean War. I then went to North Korea almost on an annual basis until 2000, and then after a few years in which they were very angry at me and wouldn't let me back in, I returned for the last time in 2005. So I have this long history of trying to figure out North Korea and of covering the North's very tortured relationship with much of the rest of the world, and especially with the United States. And one of the things, when you go to North Korea, it's a bit like going through the looking glass, in the sense that when you're on the outside, it seems like this very strange and weird and menacing place that everybody's afraid of. And you go through, and on the other side, the North is the place that feels itself under threat and is beleaguered and worried about its own survival. And I think, as I talk in the book, and we can talk more about this sense of being under threat, of trying to figure out how it can survive in a world where all its old communist allies no longer exist, or like China and Russia have embraced market economies where its own internal society is so weak, is really at the heart of the way the North Koreans have behaved and have handled the nuclear issue and handled their dealings with the United States. And so it was largely an outgrowth of all of these years of following it and covering it that I decided that it would be worth trying to dig below the surface, go beyond what you can do as a working journalist on daily deadlines. And so I embarked on the project that resulted in this book, Meltdown. I did well over 200 interviews. The idea of the book was to try and talk to everybody I could who either was involved in or knew about the pivotal moments from the late 1990s to the present day involving the nuclear crisis, and to get them to tell me their accounts of what happened. And then I put these together. It often involved repeated interviews to try and reconcile often very conflicting versions of what happened, and then to write the book as somebody described it, as diplomatic history that reads like a spy thriller. In other words, to make it accessible to a general audience. And what comes out of that is a sense that the Bush administration from the beginning was profoundly divided over how to deal with North Korea, to the extent that it was almost dysfunctional. And these internal conflicts, I think, continue to this day. You've seen tacking back and forth one way or another, from confrontation and coercion to negotiation to all sorts of mixed signals. And so we're now left today with an administration that has largely abandoned the completely unsuccessful policies that characterized its first 5 or 6 years in office, but still struggling to figure out the right way to deal with a North Korea that wants to have an accommodation with the United States to guarantee its own security, but is not prepared to be seen to be doing that from a position of weakness, and is insisting, both because they're Korean and Asian and insecure, that they be treated with dignity and respect and be given face and given legitimacy. And trying to reconcile that with American concerns about blocking their nuclear program and trying to draw them into the international community is an extremely complex process, fraught with difficulties, always in danger of going off the rails. And even though my book is finished, the last chapter has not been written, and I have a feeling that there's a lot more to play out in the coming months. So why don't we stop there, and then we can...
That's perfect. We'll have lots of time to talk about the present and future, especially in Q&A. But I thought for our part of today's session, we'll do a little bit of the historical work. Meltdown, your book, starts, I would say, around 2000, right? Quickly, for the group, set the stage. Where are we at the end of the Clinton administration?
Well, the Clinton administration in 1994 did a deal with the North Koreans called the Agreed Framework. Under that deal, the North Koreans froze their nuclear facility at Yongbyon that had been with the capability to make weapons-grade plutonium. And in return, the North was being given annual shipments of fuel oil, other kinds of aid, and there had been an expectation, the North Korean side, that eventually this might lead to a broader political thaw. The Agreed Framework was a kind of bumpy, uneven, difficult process. The Republicans who took control of Congress right after it was signed in 1994, didn't want to appropriate money to fund the fuel shipments. Many Republicans criticized the Clinton administration for appeasement, including John McCain. But in 2000, following the historic summit between North and South Korea, and in response to an initiative in 1999 by former Defense Secretary William Perry, who visited Pyongyang, and one of the people who went with him, Evans Revere, is in this room and was a very valuable source for the book. The North Koreans announced a willingness to send a high-level envoy to Washington. And in October of 2000, Vice Marshal Jo Myung-rok, very senior military leader, close to Kim Jong-Il, came to the United States, the highest-ranking North Korean ever to do so. He came to the White House. He met President Clinton in an interesting and somewhat awkward encounter, which is where I sort of begin the narrative of the current evolution of the current situation. That visit was crucially important because during it, Joe signed a communique in which the two governments pledged that they would not have hostile intent toward the other. For the North Koreans, this was really essential because the North was and still is seeking to put its relationship with the U.S. on a different kind of footing. And so I think the North Koreans saw this communique a bit like the Chinese see the Shanghai communique as the fundamental principles underpinning a new relationship. That was followed by Secretary of State Madeleine Albright's trip to North Korea, in which she met Kim Jong-il. The North Koreans had invited Clinton to visit. The U.S. side was hoping to conclude an agreement on missiles because the nuclear program had been frozen. And for a variety of reasons, Clinton didn't go. His term was running out. There was the disputed election. And the initial signs from the new administration, which had picked a moderate Colin Powell to be Secretary of State, so it led the outgoing administration to believe that the Bush administration might be a bit more cautious, but would basically continue on with this process of dealing with North Korea. So the Bush administration came in, and literally within weeks it became clear that that wasn't going to be the case, that there were very powerful neocon elements who felt that dealing with North Korea was morally wrong, that it was guaranteed to be unsuccessful, that the North would cheat, that they wanted felt the Agreed Framework was a bad deal and should be thrown out. And you had this clash, which has continued throughout the administration, between that group and people who wanted to engage, and it led to very bitter internal disputes, which essentially sabotaged the ability of the administration to deal diplomatically with North Korea.
Great. I was struck reading the book. What's going on? You know, mostly we think of North Korea as the hermit kingdom, right? This insular, sealed off place, and yet you describe what's going on from 2000 to 2002, you have Kim Jong-Il meeting with first Kim Dae-jung, with Putin, right, the first trip of a Russian head of state. Koizumi makes a trip. So you have this, and then Kim himself is making trips to Russia and to China, which you describe. It's almost like the North Korean charm offensive. What happened to that? What happened to that energy? Where was that coming from within North Korea, and where did it go?
Well, I think Kim Jong-il was trying to improve North Korea's external set of circumstances, to reduce confrontation, to develop relations with other countries, leading up to a rapprochement with Japan and a rapprochement with the United States. There's a continuing debate about the extent to which the North Korean leader is interested or has been interested in genuine reform inside North Korea, economic reform modeled on the Chinese experience or some variant thereof. There's a lot of discussion and disagreement about whether Kim is really interested or is just tinkering with it and so on. But clearly, this seemed to be part of an effort to kind of pull themselves up, reach out. And the central ingredient in that was to end this relationship of hostility with the United States that dates back to the Korean War. And in the North Korean view, the U.S. is the world's only superpower. If they could have a civilized relationship with it, it would be the best guarantee of their own security and their survival, more or less, in their current form. And in the reporting on the book, it's very interesting how from literally the moment George W. Bush was reelected, all throughout until the crisis really exploded, and even after that, the North Koreans were consistently signaling they wanted to talk, they wanted to negotiate, they were willing to put all the problems on the table. One shouldn't for a minute naively assume that that willingness would translate into anything like an easy negotiation or that they were going to happily give up these things that the U.S. was worried about. But certainly all the signals were very clear all along. But the signals back from the Bush administration were mixed at best. I write in Meltdown about the policy review that the administration conducted after taking office, which was the first huge fight between those who wanted to deal with North Korea and those who wanted to confront North Korea. One of the issues that came up in this review was whether a statement of the policy of the new administration should include a reaffirmation of this no hostile intent clause in the communique. And the State Department Korea people were arguing that it should. And the hardliners were saying it shouldn't, and in the end the hardliners won, and Tom Hubbard, who went on to be your boss as ambassador in Seoul, has a wonderful quote where he said they didn't want to say they had no hostile intent because they had hostile intent, and they thought it was a mistake to say otherwise. And you also have the visit by South Korean President Kim Dae-jung in March of 2001, which was an absolute disaster. In retrospect, it's clear that it was a mistake for him to have come so early.
With Bush.
With Bush, he was the first Asian leader to see Bush, and he wanted to come. He was concerned about. He told me when I interviewed him, he was concerned about Bush abandoning the engagement policy, and he thought. I'm a Nobel Peace Prize winner. I've always been treated with respect. I'm 30 years older. Then I can tell this new guy what's what, and he'll listen to me. He was warned off it. He said the new administration hasn't got its act together. They don't have their Asia hands in place, and so. But he went anyway, and this was where we see the first real evidence of the loathing that Bush, this kind of visceral loathing that Bush had, and I assume still has, towards Kim Jong-il. In this meeting, Bush was very critical of the Sunshine Policy. He was very dismissive of Kim Jong-il. He was very disrespectful towards the South Korean president. And that was really the moment where it became clear that things were going to be different. And it also, in addition to worrying the North Koreans, I think was a critical moment in souring U.S. relations with South Korea, which went through a very, very rough patch that followed. Then you had 9/11, and in the wake of 9/11, Again, there's a very interesting episode I write about in the book where the North Koreans desperately tried to signal after 9/11 that they didn't want to be lumped in with the bad guys that the U.S. was going to strike out at. They signed on to some UN covenants about terrorism. They expressed condolences. They used back-channel signals because they were worried that they would be lumped in, and of course they were in the axis of evil. And so you have the axis of evil speech and a continuing battle over whether or not the U.S. should talk to the North Koreans. But it was not monopolized only by the hardline side. By the middle of 2002,
yeah, talk about
Powell and others.
Powell's a very interesting figure.
Powell's very interesting. I mean, he clearly wanted to talk to the North Koreans. He felt the Clintonites were too soft, but he clearly wanted to engage diplomatically. For a variety of reasons, he didn't fight back when the hardliners did these various provocative things. Whether it was he had bigger fish to fry, whether it was hubris, a sense that I'm going to be the guy who runs the show in the end, and I don't need to worry about these minor irritations. I don't know, but as a result, he kind of ceded bureaucratic ground to the hardliners and weakened his own position. But they managed in the middle of 2002 to come up. He got Bush to sign off on what was called the bold approach. There was not much content to this bold approach, but at least this idea that we would have some dealings with the North Koreans and try and forge a new relationship. And then in the summer of 2002, you have the pivotal moment to which I devote a whole chapter, which is the uncovering by American intelligence of a clandestine North Korean effort to acquire components for uranium program.
Right, and this diplomatically comes out in the Kelly mission, right, which is another thing you obviously did a lot of research
Right.
about. Lay that out. I mean, something for the experts, they all
Right.
know this stuff in and out. For the average American, what's going on with uranium versus plutonium gets confusing. So what's the story?
It's
and what
confusing
happened?
and it's complicated. It has some echoes of the controversies over intelligence involving Iraq. I used to be in TV and can talk in 30-second sound bites. This takes a little longer, but basically what happened is in the spring and summer of 2002, American intelligence came up with pretty solid evidence that the North Koreans were embarked on an effort, a large-scale effort, to get components that could be used in a program to enrich uranium and make a uranium bomb. In the late 90s, already there had been some intelligence of the North Koreans having a kind of R&D level effort. They clearly had some dealings with A.Q. Khan at that point. But they were clearly going at it in a much bigger way, and they were trying to buy aluminum tubes and all sorts of other stuff that really could only conceivably be used for a uranium program. So the question became, what do you make of the intelligence, and what are the policy options? The intelligence folks said, let me hit pause for a minute. Later, a kind of conventional narrative was put about, which I think has been largely gone into the general understanding of this, that the North Koreans were caught with a secret uranium enrichment program. Assistant Secretary of State James Kelly was sent to Pyongyang in October to confront them. They admitted it. As a result, the U.S. cut off shipments of fuel supplies promised under the agreed framework, and the North Koreans retaliated by restarting their nuclear program. The reality is a lot more complicated, which is what I discovered doing the research for Meltdown. The reality is the intelligence was pretty solid that they were getting components for uranium program. But there has never been, to my understanding, then and up to today, any credible intelligence that anybody has been willing to talk about that the North Koreans actually have the capability to enrich uranium. Maybe there is a secret factory in under a mountain somewhere. There's no intelligence that anybody's ever acknowledged that exists that shows it. There's no intelligence that shows they ever actually enriched uranium. And the intelligence community's assessment in 2002 was that this was CIA said publicly, mid-decade at the earliest. Some people felt 5, 7, 10 years before, if they put all of these bits together, they would actually be able to make a uranium-based bomb. And the reason why that's important is if the North Koreans could make a uranium-based bomb now, it's one thing. If it's a half dozen years or more away, it gives you options to deal with it. And so, again, the so-called moderates said, we need to raise this issue. We should raise it with them as a major problem in the context of a broader negotiation on improving relations. Hardliners like John Bolton, who came into the administration with one of his primary goals to kill the agreed framework, and others said, this is the smoking gun, this proves that they're cheating, it proves we can't deal with them, we have to confront them. And these were folks who were essentially looking for a reason to destroy a diplomatic engagement because they felt it was wrong and they felt that it was pointless. And they won the day in terms, the compromise was that Assistant Secretary Kelly was allowed to go to North Korea, but his instructions were, you can't negotiate, you essentially have to read them the Riot Act and nothing else. The North Koreans thought he was coming to negotiate. Finally, after 2 years of not doing anything, we've got an American envoy, we can pick up where we left off with Clinton. But Kelly went with instructions not to negotiate, moreover, with instructions to be deliberately rude. He was not allowed to host a return banquet for his North Korean hosts. He was ordered not to raise his glass in a toast at the banquet that they were going to host for him. And the other part of the story is that the North Koreans supposedly admitted Kelly's allegation. And as best I could tell in trying to reconstruct this episode, they didn't. They used much more ambiguous language. The Americans came away with the impression that they had it, but the North Koreans never actually said it explicitly. And they did offer to negotiate. But Kelly sold them. He said, I'm not here to negotiate. Instead, he went back to Washington. This was kept closely guarded secret for 10 days while Congress passed the authorization for the president to use military force in Iraq. Right. And then it became public. But it became public in this version that I mentioned earlier, and even the moderates were sort of unable to resist this pressure to take tough action. And one of the other, just say one other thing, one of the themes that comes out if you look at North Koreans' behavior is, if you engage with them, they're willing to engage. If you push, they push back twice as hard. And people said that, warned at the time that was going to happen. But they were ignored. So when the fuel supplies were cut off, the North Koreans kicked out international inspectors, announced they were going to restart the Yongbyon nuclear reactor, and we escalated into this kind of meltdown scenario.
And this is the sort of nuclear breakout. Right?
This is the nuclear breakout. And I mean, it was a very bad thing the North Koreans did, but to understand it, you have to look at the context. They'd been expecting to engage in a negotiation, finally, with the Bush administration, which they were prepared to do despite axis of evil and all this other stuff. Instead, Kelly came. He was, in their view, rude. In fact, somebody who went to North Korea right afterwards and met senior North Korean officials said they were more angry at his refusal to host a banquet than at the substance of what he said. They were so offended by this as an example of being disrespected.
Kelly himself was frustrated, right?
Kelly was frustrated, but
he felt like a trained monkey could do his job.
That's what one of the hardliners who didn't like Kelly said to me. He said, we crafted these instructions so trained monkey could do it. But Kelly is he's a decent, honorable guy. He has vast experience about Asia, but he was trapped bureaucratically in a situation. And he's an old military man. You get your orders, you salute and follow them. And so, but the other part of it is, in early 2003, as the North Koreans ratcheted up their nuclear program, what was going on in the world? The U.S. was gearing up to invade Iraq. You had this doctrine of preemption, and then Saddam Hussein was overthrown. This, of course, all following the successful toppling of the Taliban. And so the old joke about even paranoids have enemies. If you're North Korea and you sit here and you've seen 2 years of axis of evil and all this other rhetoric, albeit mixed in with some other signs of being more willing to deal, but that's the prevailing tone. And then you see the U.S. acting, and you have people like John Bolton saying after Saddam fell, countries like North Korea and Syria and others ought to heed the lesson of Iraq, i.e. shape up or you could suffer the same fate. And this really freaked the North Koreans out. In the late winter of 2003, I was in Seoul for most of this. Remember Kim Jong-Il disappeared for like 75 days. No no sightings of him. He wasn't mentioned in the press. They were really scared they were going to be next. And North Koreans have said publicly that if you look at what happened to Saddam Hussein, he didn't have nukes. They started up their nuclear program again, and Kim Jong-il is still around. So there is some internal logic from, if you're sitting in Pyongyang, to this. Although even during this whole period, the North kept saying, if we can talk to the United States, we can negotiate. And the Americans kept sending very mixed signals about whether they were willing to. And then finally you had the start of the six-party talks, which the first several rounds went nowhere, largely because the U.S. wasn't willing to engage.
Let's talk a little bit more about we're focusing on North Korea and the U.S., but we're here at the Asia Society. This is hosted by the Center on U.S. China Relations and our policy department. Maybe talk a little bit about China. How is China watching all of this happen, right? Because obviously the huge trend of this period is China's peaceful rise,
right.
and it's emerged now. They're playing a major, maybe the major diplomatic role in all this. How do you in the book and in your thinking chart China's role?
Well, the Chinese had been rather passive about all of this until early 2003. From what I could figure out, they were very alarmed at the turn of events then. They were really worried that the Bush administration might do something aggressive towards North Korea as the North staged its nuclear breakout. And as best I could tell, you had a group of people in Beijing and think tanks and the foreign ministry saying, we can't just sit passively by and let this unfold this way because it's harmful to Chinese interests. The last thing China needs is a new conflict between the Americans and the North Koreans. And the last thing China needs is for North Korea to go nuclear. So the Chinese were much more open to being involved, and then Colin Powell actually sought out China's help because Powell was kind of stuck in this situation. He kept trying to find ways out of it, but was constrained on all sides. So he got the Chinese to help, and initially the Chinese brokered a three-way meeting in April of 2003 in Beijing, where Assistant Secretary Kelly went out and the North Koreans sent Lee Gun from their formerly here at the UN, as the North American Department of the Foreign Ministry. And that was I talk in the book about this sort of this weird dance in which the North Koreans, the Chinese said to the Americans, you can come, it'll be a three-way meeting. And it sort of hinted to the North Koreans, if you come, you'll get your two-way meeting, which is, the North Koreans always wanted to deal bilaterally with the U.S.
Why is that?
Partly because they see this as a problem with the U.S. The North Koreans are not worried that Russia is going to topple them. They don't like the Japanese, but they're not worried the Japanese are going to topple them. They see this as with the U.S., and so they were reluctant to have others involved. And also, they wanted the legitimacy that would be conferred by having these dealings directly with the U.S. Washington, for its part, at that stage, was adamant it was not going to deal directly with the North Koreans. So you had this very strange episode where they have a three-way meeting, and then they have a dinner, and after the dinner, the North Korean guy literally ambushes Jim Kelly in a corner of the room and kind of corners him so he can't escape, and gets his interpreter over and reads this formal statement. And Kelly was kind of trapped there, and he couldn't push the guy away to run away, and so they had this two-way conversation, and yet again, it was one of these cases. On the one hand, the North Koreans made all these threats about, it's up to you whether we transfer nuclear material or develop our program more, but then they also offered to negotiate. But what happened was that Kelly was not in a position to really respond, and in his delegation, which was loaded with people from all the rival agencies who were fighting each other, each of whom had their own phone chains and email chains back to Washington, they went back, and before Kelly could even finish a thoughtful memo back to his bosses, somebody had called back, and one of the leading hardliners called the newspapers and leaked the threat part of what the North Koreans said without the other part, and it was in the media almost immediately. North Koreans threatened to export nuclear weapons. And this actually was a pattern that you see throughout the six-party talks, reflecting the divisions in the United States. Both Kelly and later Christopher Hill, they had people from the NSC, from the Pentagon, all the different agencies who were involved in the process, many of whose goals were to prevent the State Department lead person from doing what they most wanted to do, which is actually engage in diplomacy. And this was one of the things that really crippled the process. And that was true in that meeting. It was true in the six-party talks, which the Chinese played a central role in setting up in the summer of 2003, which I covered. And it was true in the second and third rounds of six-party talks, which went nowhere. And the American approach at that time, although there were some modifications, and in the book I go into some of the details, basically the position that Kelly was forced to present was, we'll meet with you to discuss the terms of your capitulation to our demands on the nuclear issue. And that's really, the North Koreans would come in with these proposals, well, we might freeze if, you give us aid and do this and that. And some is clearly an opening gambit and nothing that was immediately plausible. But the Americans said, nothing can be discussed until you essentially give in. And so they were at a stalemate. Meanwhile, the North Koreans were churning out weapons-grade plutonium at a rapid clip. And this really went on until 2005, when the second Bush administration came into being, and you had a change in secretaries of state, and Christopher Hill was brought in to be the new assistant secretary.
Let's talk about Chris Hill, because in a way he's kind of the knight in shining armor who gets to mix metaphors, he gets out of the straitjacket diplomatically. But he came in earlier than even I realized, that he was still being held back, and you describe that. Talk about.
Well, before we do, could I take advantage of Ambassador Holbrook's presence, because Chris Hill was your deputy in the Bosnia peace negotiations, and you know probably better than any of us what he's like as an operator and a negotiator. And if I could prevail upon you to share some insights about him, which will probably go a long way towards explaining how he behaved later, I'd be very interested.
It's a good segue into the opening.
Mike, he has been on this podium many times. He's a real member of our family, and since this is your show, and many of the people here know him, and everybody knows that I think he's outstanding, I would rather comment after you do, because I'm really here to hear.
Right. Fair enough.
But I hope you will explain not just your view of his personality, but also explain why the administration changed positions. How did it happen? And what role did each of the principals play in it?
Well, fair enough. In my book, I use a quote from you in which you talk about his abilities as a negotiator. And he did have this reputation of being able to deal with bad guys. And the Milosevic and the rest of the people that you were stuck with dealing with in the mid-1990s. And he was... War criminals, yeah. So I think people felt, well, if he can deal with those guys, then maybe he could deal with the North Koreans. And so he was brought in as assistant secretary for East Asia. He made it clear to Condoleezza Rice that he wanted to be able to talk to North Koreans. And it's hard to tell with Rice. In the first Bush administration, as national security advisor, she was pretty hard line. It's hard to tell whether she simply was too weak to put her own imprint, given the elephants battling Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, Colin Powell. But in any event, her role was to the extent that it was much more on the hardline side. When she came in as Secretary of State, the dynamic changed in many ways, not least because she had a relationship with George Bush that Powell didn't. And I think Iraq was beginning to get messy, and I think she realized that confrontation alone was not going to work. Hill pushed, though, very hard, arguing that it was absolutely essential to talk to people. And in the summer of 2005, he signaled to the North Koreans that they were trying to get the North Koreans to come back to the six-party talks, which they'd held off returning to from mid-2004, waiting to see who was going to win the election. And he took a number of steps to try and reach out to the North Koreans, arranging a phone call with one of their envoys here after many months of not the U.S. not being willing to reach out. And then there was an episode in the July of 2005 when he went to Beijing, and there was a dinner that the Chinese had set up, and it was going to be the Chinese and the North Koreans and Hill. And he gets to the restaurant, and there's no Chinese. And then the North Koreans show up, and Hill has realized that the Chinese are sort of setting him up. And he had to decide, would he stay or would he go? And his instructions were not to meet bilaterally, but he stayed. And at the end of that meeting, he got the North Koreans to agree to come back to the six-party talks, because the North had been saying all along, if we have a bilateral meeting, we'll come back. And then when Rice arrived in Beijing, he went to see her, and he said, I've got bad news and good news. The bad news is I violated my instructions and had a bilateral meeting. The good news is, because of that, the North Koreans are coming back to the six-party talks. Rice wasn't pleased, and she complained to the Chinese foreign minister, and he said, just worry about the results. And then in August and September of 2005, you have negotiations which led to this September 19th declaration. And Hill, in talking to me, said that his idea of how to approach this was to try and, he said, model a little bit on Bosnia, identify the principles that would govern any deal first and get everybody to sign off on that, and then start working the details. So they tried to hammer out this agreement, which led on September 19th, finally it was to being signed. And it was a complicated process, because Hill's delegation was full of people who opposed him and who were trying to sabotage him. And this is where you begin to get this pattern, which has emerged subsequently, of Hill circumventing all the others, going around them, and essentially just dealing with Rice and then having Rice deal with the president. And he was able, with many twists and turns, to get her to sign off on this deal, which I think marked an important moment, because it was the first time the United States was willing to put in writing, as a matter of principle, that it was willing to have civilized relationship with the North Koreans, move towards normal relations if the North Koreans denuclearized. But he had people sniping at him all the way, and at many points got very, very discouraged by this. And even in this September 19th deal, there's an episode I talk about in the book where they finally got the deal. They got this declaration. And then Hill was told that as the price, essentially, for getting the okay to sign off on the declaration, that he was going to have to read a sort of side statement, which was the unilateral American interpretation of the declaration. And, of course, that was crafted by prominent hardliners in Washington. And if you look at it, it's all in sort of hardline language. It's all their most extreme positions. And when he got it, he was floored, and he thought, this is a real problem. And then he figured, or at least what he said was, this is not great, but the declaration is the formal document, and so we can manage. So he read this thing, and the North Koreans were furious, and more or less signaled that if you're going to take that kind of approach, then we're going to back off some of the commitments that we've made. And at the same time, the decision was made and leaked to the Wall Street Journal that the U.S. Treasury Department was going to move against this bank in Macau, the Banco Delta Asia, where the North Koreans entities had accounts that the Treasury Department said were suspected money laundering concerns. And I think that was also clearly intended to sabotage this emerging diplomatic process, as it did for the better part of a year. And I mean, people sort of forget about it now, but the BDA controversy was one of the critical things that led to the nuclear test, because the North Koreans...
October
of 06, because once the North Koreans said, once these sanctions took effect, unless we get our money back, we're not coming back to the talks. And they proposed a number of solutions. And Lee Siegel, who's here, was one of the people I write about in the book who had some discussions with the North Koreans about ideas they had about how to get out of this. There was an idea of like a bilateral mechanism the U.S. and North Korea could set up to try and address these concerns, and a North Korean official came to the U.S. in March of '06 for what was supposed to be a briefing by the Treasury Department on these sanctions. As an indication of how screwy the atmosphere was in Washington, neither Christopher Hill nor anyone else who had actually been involved in the six-party talks was allowed to attend this briefing. Only another person from the State Department, Kathy Stevens, who's now going to be the new U.S. ambassador in Seoul, but at the time did not have any experience dealing directly with the North Koreans, was allowed to attend. And the North Korean idea of a bilateral mechanism was rejected, and so were repeated North Korean appeals for bilateral talks. And it's very clear that as the North Koreans concluded that the Americans wouldn't talk to them face-to-face and wouldn't address this issue of the money in the Macau bank, those were critical factors in leading them both to test missiles on July 4th of 2006 and to stage the nuclear test.
All right, well, I want to get quickly to the group. We've already been pointing out some very interesting people in the crowd who I hope are ready with some questions. But just to kind of bring us up into the present a little bit and round out the narrative, the way I'd ask as a general question is, finally in October '06, you have the detonation of the bomb, and then subsequently an even harder push in the U.S. side, on the U.S. side, led by Chris Hill and Condi Rice, to seem to engage more. Are we in a new pattern? Did the meltdown end at some point? Because you finished the book, well, I mean, we're still in the middle of it. But when you see the news coming out now, is it all the same story that you were telling, or are we in kind of a new phase?
Well, when I was a TV journalist and I couldn't think of a stand-up, the temptation was always to say there's a 50-50 chance it could go either way. And I kind of think we're at that point. I mean, the nuclear test was a critical turning point because it was the moment when it became glaringly obvious, if it wasn't already, that coercing and pressuring North Korea is going to lead the North Koreans to do the exact opposite of what you want. And that was a non-starter. And it led to Christopher Hill at the end of October of 2006, again violating instructions, and again in a situation, this time it was a lunch rather than a dinner that the Chinese set up. They had a three-way lunch, and then the Chinese guy got up and walked out and left Hill with the North Koreans. And again, Hill ignored his instructions and met with Kim Gae-gwan, and as a result, both of the fact of the meeting and that Hill told Kim that the U.S. was prepared to work on a mechanism to resolve the Macau bank thing, the North Koreans agreed to come back to the six-party talks. And Rice wasn't happy about his violating the instructions, but particularly after the congressional elections in November of 2006, when the Democrats took control of Congress and it was clear that the public sentiment in the United States on the Iraq War and on the administration had soured, the appeal of trying to find some way out of this mess and the possibility that it could become a positive foreign policy legacy it strengthened the position of Hill and of Rice and of people who were more willing to engage. And one of the things that's interesting, everybody talks about how difficult the North Koreans are to deal with, and they're not easy. But in 2005, from when the North Koreans agreed to come back to the six-party talks until they reached the September 19th declaration, was barely 2 months. In 2006, from when they agreed to come back to the six-party talks till when they reached the so-called February 13th agreement, it was barely 4 months. And of course, in 1994, the agreed framework was negotiated in just 3 or 4 months. So there's a track record that under certain circumstances, you can actually reach deals with the North Koreans. And I think lost in all the, I would just say parenthetically, if you're still following any of what I've said, I take my hat off to you. This is an incredibly complicated story. And for journalists who are generalists, who don't follow this day in and day out, it is really hard to make sense of. And I think as a result, you get a kind of a certain very superficial narrative about what's happened and certain general notions about the North Koreans or the U.S. get implanted in people's minds. And so I think as you look at what's going on today, where they're again at a very difficult moment, it's important to keep in mind the fact that they did reach this agreement in February. The North Koreans were supposed to start the disabling of their reactor within 60 days, but they said they wouldn't do it till they got their money back from Macau, for a variety of reasons, which I talk about in the book, having to do, again, with internal battles between Treasury and State. It took a lot longer, and it wasn't until June of '07 that they got the money back. And literally within days of the money being returned to North Korea, they had the IAEA in, and they started the disabling process. And, you know, if you look at where we were in October of 2006, with the North having tested a bomb on a collision course with everybody, tensions very high, and where we are today, it's pretty impressive, and I think you have to acknowledge that fact. Yongbyon is largely disabled. They've blown up the cooling tower on television. There are American and international inspectors there. They're sawing through things and chaining things and making it day by day harder for the North Koreans to start this again. The North Koreans have given over 100,000 pages of records from Yongbyon, and this is a world's most secretive society, so that's pretty amazing. And so you have a degree of openness and a degree of access, but you also have some very complicated, outstanding issues revolving around this declaration. Part of this deal was that the North Koreans were supposed to not only disable Yongbyon, but give a declaration of all their nuclear facilities and materials and so on. And then the U.S. was supposed to take them off the list of states sponsoring terrorism and lift sanctions under the Trading with the Enemy Act, and that's something the North Koreans had wanted for a very long time. Well, that was supposed to happen by the end of last year. It didn't happen until June, and in the end it got very sticky. The North Korean declaration focused only on plutonium. They didn't want to include what had happened with their uranium efforts, and then another controversial element was came to the center stage last fall when the Israelis destroyed a nuclear reactor, what appeared to be a nuclear reactor that was being built in Syria, and the intelligence leaks that came out indicated that the North Koreans had been helping to build this. And so even though it was not in the earlier agreements, the Americans insisted the North Koreans had to come clean on this as well, and the North Koreans didn't want to do it. So Christopher Hill's argument was, keep your eyes on the prize. The immediate security threat is plutonium, and we should not make rolling back the plutonium program hostage to these other things, especially since there's no intelligence that they're actually enriching uranium or that they have a facility to do so now. And since whatever they were doing with the Syrians, the Israelis very conveniently turned into a pile of dust in the desert. So while these are very important and worrisome issues, they're somewhat less immediate, and if you let them stand in the way of something that would allow would get the North Koreans out of the plutonium business, or on their way out of the plutonium business, that was a mistake. So the declaration was greeted with a lot of skepticism by a lot of people, partly because it was only about plutonium, and partly because it didn't actually include information about their fissile material, where their bombs are, and partly because the uranium and the Syrian issue were fudged in a kind of side letter in which the North Koreans acknowledged American concerns, but there are still a lot of question marks. And then after the declaration came through, the president announced that he was going to take them off the terrorism list. And then the issue has become, how do you verify this declaration? And that's where we're at now. The Americans have given the North Koreans very detailed indications of what they want in terms of access, in terms of people going in with instruments to take measurements and so on. The North Koreans haven't agreed on this. On the business of the terrorism list, it's a 45-day notification period, which comes due on the 11th of August, after which technically the North Koreans ought to be off the list. But the American officials from the president on down are now signaling that if the North Koreans don't satisfy U.S. concerns on verification, they may not come off the list. And I think it's possible that the North Koreans will say that's not fair and push back in some form, although it is hard to tell. And it's also hard to tell whether the positions that we're hearing from President Bush and others are how much give there is in that, how much of what is being said is to sort of mollify critics in Congress, because there's a lot of angst and hostility in Congress about this perception that we're giving the North Koreans more than we're getting, although I think the reality is the other way around. The North is actually shutting down a facility that can make bombs that it sees as central to its national security. The U.S. is changing a list that it could change back at any time. So I think, in fact, the North Koreans are giving more than the United States. But the way it gets translated around, and particularly in the often superficial press coverage, where people aren't as obsessed with this thing as I've been, it gets very muddy. So we're again at this kind of turning point where maybe it will go forward, maybe it will go backwards. And President Bush yesterday in a speech in Bangkok used pretty tough language, tougher than he's used in a while. Again, whether that's to mollify Congress or whether that represents another shift in an administration that's gone like this for 7 years, I don't know.
All right, well, we've got a great group here of others who are equally obsessed and some who are just curious, and Mike would love questions from both groups.
Today, we have in the DPRK a new nuclear weapons state, in effect. Their nuclear weapons test was not the most impressive thing in the world, but it was a nuclear weapons test. And there's not much precedent on planet Earth for countries who have gone nuclear becoming non-nuclear. We have anywhere between 30 and 40 kilograms of plutonium in North Korea today, whereas back in 2000 we had 8 to 10 or so by most estimates. And there's no clear indication of how that plutonium will ever get out of North Korea, despite the progress that's been made. And I want to give full credit, by the way, as you did, to all the good diplomacy that's been done to try to get us back into a better place over the last couple of years. We have a declaration that's been provided by the DPRK that has, to put it politely, some significant holes in it in terms of key components of North Korea's nuclear weapons production program. We have an understanding, if that's the right word, that we have agreed to set aside for now the issue of uranium, which, as you rightly pointed out, was what got us into this mess back in 2002. And we also have agreed, in effect, to set aside the issue of proliferation, the cooperation with Syria and perhaps others, an activity which, by the way, our Secretary of State described a few weeks ago as disturbing. And the implication of what she was saying was that there are other revelations that might come out at some point regarding what the North has been doing. With all of that, and perhaps more that some more critical of who are more critical of the process than I might add to this list, let me throw the question to you that Ambassador Holbrook alluded to earlier, and that is, are we better off today than we were 8 years ago?
That's, I think, you have to say no, because 8 years ago, as you correctly pointed out, the North Koreans maybe had enough weapons-grade plutonium for 1 or 2 bombs, and their nuclear program was frozen, and they were engaged in a process of cautious rapprochement. Today, it's clear that the Yongbyon reactor is much more further along in terms of being disabled. I think that's important, and the North Koreans have been more forthcoming. But they've got 6 to 10 bombs, or 6 to 10 bombs worth of weapons-grade plutonium there, and that makes it much, much harder to roll back if it's going to be possible at all. And, I mean, you raise a very interesting point. Most countries that go nuclear don't voluntarily decide no longer to go nuclear. Once the North Koreans made all this stuff, staged this test, announced it triumphantly to their own public in their own domestic media, trumpeted themselves as a new nuclear power, it becomes much, much harder to justify internally, particularly in a society where the military is so dominant and where Kim Jong-Il is clearly dependent on the military for his own hold on power to some degree. So I think it is not inconceivable that for the foreseeable future, the outcome here is the world is stuck with a nuclear North Korea, which it cannot undo. And that's a very scary prospect. And that leads then to the question of, well, what do you do in response? And there are very few good options. I think the track record of the first 5 or 6 years of the Bush administration shows that pressure, coercion, and sanctions simply don't work. I mean, this is a regime that let 2 million of its own people starve to death in the 1990s. This is a regime that would not take food aid from South Korea recently because the South Koreans wanted them to actually ask for it and express appreciation for getting it. And so they're willing to let their people suffer to make a political point. As long as the elite manages okay, then that's not going to have that big an impact. And even when the elite gets targeted, as was done at one point earlier in the Bush administration, I remember they issued this astonishing list. Do you remember in fall, late 2006? No iPods, no Segways, no cognac, and some columnist in the newspaper said the only way that no cognac is going to hurt the North Koreans is if they use it to fuel their missiles. So I think the problem here is that doesn't work, and there's no military option that's credible. The U.S. is bogged down in Iraq, it's bogged down in Afghanistan, the economy here is a mess. There's no sensible American administration is going to do something that could lead to a new Korean war. Moreover, the Chinese and even this new South Korean government aren't going to sign off on something like that. So the problem is, if you can't go in and take it out, which would be militarily very difficult and would guarantee a North Korean response that would level Seoul or have missiles hit Japan, and now they've got nuclear material they can put on those missiles, or give fissile material to terrorists or whatever. What are your options? It's all bad circumstances. And the one thing, though, so then it becomes the North Koreans continue to say, if we can have an accommodation with the U.S., we don't need nuclear weapons. It may be that the only conceivable moment at which the North might let anybody know where its bombs were or put it under IAEA supervision would be on the day that Air Force One arrives in Pyongyang for an American president to preside over the opening of a U.S. embassy. And I'm not entirely joking here. Why, if you're North Korea, would you give this up before that? And a new peace treaty that would replace the armistice that ended the fighting in the Korean War but is still not a final peace. If you're North Korea, you have every incentive not to give any of this up until then. If then, it's not clear they would then. But the other point is, if you're not in a hostile confrontational relationship, then the odds of the North Koreans doing something really terrible with these bombs presumably would be less. I mean, it's a bit flip to say that, the British have nuclear weapons and we don't worry about that. Well, clearly it's not the same. But the point here is, if you're in a confrontational relationship, it gets more dangerous. But none of these options are appealing, and none of them are politically viable or saleable. It's going to be very tough for any American president to go to Congress and say, these are horrible people, they defied us, they got the bomb, and our only choice is to make nice. That is not going to fly. But the alternatives aren't going to fly either.
Okay, other questions out there? Yes. If you could briefly introduce yourself, too.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Pinkas Javits, I'm running a website now, a sustainability tank. .info. Now, two aspects. A forward-looking aspect, would you dare to say something about Iran? A backward aspect, something that happened at the UN. There was a big discussion about the funding that UNDP and other organizations did in North Korea. Now, the money came in a very backward conversion rate. The UN was paying $5 for a pencil, things like that. Now, the question is, who knew about what was later considered as a funding of the creation of the North Korean bomb with UN money? Now, this question came up, and there was a long debate at the UN.
Well, on Iran, I'm not an expert on Iran. I would only say the Iranians are probably watching all of this very carefully. They will have noted that the North Koreans got bilateral, high-level meetings with the United States. They got professions from the United States, the willingness to have diplomatic relations, all sorts of things that the U.S. has not been willing to offer to Iran. And they will also noted that the North Koreans managed to stage their nuclear breakout without any American military action. So who knows how that's being played. The UNDP funding issue is complicated. I mean, the North Koreans have a very strict exchange rate for foreigners. When I went there for CNN, we had to exchange at this ridiculous rate that bore no relationship to the black market rate and in dollars, and there was nothing you could do about it. My impression is that this allegation that the UNDP was doing something untoward was led by an American official at the UN who was closely associated with the sort of hardline neocon group. I don't know off the top of my head all the details. My guess is this is one of these sort of less there than meets the eye, but all dealings with the North Koreans tend to be fraught. They tend to gouge you, and any foreign organization is dealing with organs of the North Korean state, and that's just the way it is.
May I just add to this point? This question has come back up now relating to Burma. It's the same situation where the exchange rates are so bad that in effect you spend much more than you want to achieve.
Right. I've been in Burma, and I remember my main memory is that I went in 1989, and they had changed the currency because Ne Win, the general who ruled Burma at the time, his astrologer said that 9 was the lucky number. So they'd gotten rid of all the 5 and 10 and 50 chot notes, and it was 9 and 18 and 90 and so on. But the rate was ridiculous, and we had to do all our exchanging on the black market.
Yeah.
I'm Rhonda Hauben, and I write for Oh My News International in South Korea, the English edition, and Telepolis, which is in Germany. Again, I write in English for both. And my question has to do with something related to both, which has to do with the fact that unification is a real issue for Korea. And I wondered your thoughts. I realize the current situation in South Korea complicates this tremendously, but I wondered with the new embassy and new ambassador whether there's any way there can be support for things to get better rather than worse. And then the second piece is I just wanted to raise the issue with what you said about Congress. There's all the hostility, but yet when the New York Philharmonic went to North Korea, it seemed that anyone who could go wanted to go, and I thought people in this country were delighted. So is there some way to build that kind of acceptance in this country and welcoming? And I thought in North Korea it did the same thing. So I wondered your thoughts about that.
Well, on the first one, there's an old joke, which I think some of you have heard, about the North Korean and the South Korean who die and they go to heaven. Do you know this joke? And they ask, so they're welcomed in, and God says, okay, here, what would you like to know? And they said, can we ask you a question? Okay. So they each say, when will Korea be unified? And God says, not in my lifetime. I think it's a long way away, certainly in a negotiated sense. And now you have this very unpleasant situation. The North Koreans seem to have made a decision they're simply not going to deal with the current South Korean administration of President Lee Myung-bak. They've called him a traitor. The whole North-South rapprochement is dead in its tracks for the moment. I mean, obviously, if North Korea were to collapse, it would be a different scenario. And certainly you keep hearing reports of fraying at the edges of internal tensions. But we've been hearing these reports for a long time. Sooner or later, I assume something will happen. But I remember as a journalist, after Kim Il-sung died in 1994, and the debate was, well, Kim Jong-Il is such a flake, how long can he hold on? A month, 6 months, a year? Well, here we are 14 years later, he's outlasted everybody. Now, he's going to be, I mean, there are reasons to worry. He's 65. He doesn't have a successor. The country is beset with economic problems. There's a tremendous amount of internal tensions. Does that translate into a North Korean collapse sooner rather than later? I don't know. I kind of doubt it because I think the controls are very, very tight. Short of that, the North-South thaw seems to be on hold for the moment, and so I think we're going to have both Koreas around for a while. On the New York Philharmonic, I mean, it's hard to say. We should really ask Evans about that. He was central in setting that trip up. I mean, it seems to have generated some goodwill, though also a lot of critical comment about going there, legitimizing the awful North Korean system. I think the North Koreans used it as a signal to their own people that maybe not all Americans were monsters, and the imagery, the symbolism of an American orchestra playing the Star-Spangled Banner live on North Korean television was not lost on politically sophisticated North Koreans. And I think, if there can be more of these kinds of exchanges, it would be a good thing. But that in and of itself is, not going to solve the issue if the other broader issues aren't dealt with.
Okay.
Henry Segerman, International Investment Advisors. I wanted to ask you about China. About 4 or 5 years ago, they cut off their fuel oil to North Korea for 72 hours. As I understand it, they supply 50% of all the fuel oil that goes to North Korea. And I guess you could guess that if they wanted to, they could force North Korea to hand over every atom of plutonium tomorrow simply by cutting off the fuel oil. Do they recognize that they have vast leverage over North Korea? The Chinese you've spoken to about this, how do you think that relationship could come into play in the future?
I'm not convinced that the North Koreans would turn every ounce of plutonium over. I think they might be quite happy to go down with the ship rather than do that. I remember in 1994 a North Korean saying, when I was in Pyongyang and talking about American policy, don't force us to commit suicide. So that's not a given, number one. Number two, it is not in China. The Chinese, I think, are less than thrilled with Kim Jong-Il. They don't like what's been going on in North Korea. They are enormously frustrated that Kim has been unwilling to follow their advice and implement Chinese-style economic reforms. And every time he's gone to China, they've taken him recently, they've taken him around, they took him to Shanghai, they've taken him to Shenzhen, they've tried to show him what you can achieve and still keep your ruling party in power, but he hasn't really followed through. And I think after the North Koreans defied the Chinese in 2006 and staged first the missile tests and then the nuclear tests, the Chinese were furious. And it's my impression that, and there were some Chinese intellectuals and think tanks that were talking about, do we really need this guy? Should we get rid of this guy? But the Chinese really don't want instability in North Korea because they're going to have to do a lot of the cleaning up of the mess. I don't see them intervening. I don't see them squeezing the North to bring it to its knees. It's not totally impossible if something happened to Kim Jong-il or you had another really major dangerous crisis that they might intervene to try and lance the boil, but I'm not so sure. So I don't think and the North Koreans really don't like the Chinese telling them what to do. So everybody thinks, the Chinese have all this leverage, but I don't think the Chinese are prepared to use it that much for the reasons I've outlined, and I don't think the North Koreans are prepared to listen that much. Did you have something you were about to?
Oh, sure.
Mike, thank you for a terrific presentation. I agree with your assessments. Very briefly on Chris Hill, he is a very good negotiator and as you demonstrated, a very creative one. And I don't think we'd be where we are today. Although you did not really address the specific and big question, which is why did Condoleezza Rice change her position? And even more important, why did Bush change his position? And in the same category, what happened to Dick Cheney? who didn't change his
Right.
position. So, and yet he seems to have lost out big time, to use his favorite word. So that's one issue. The one I particularly, and you might want to address that. I'd also like you to address the current situation. Now, as I understand it, and I haven't talked to Chris in a week or two. He's in Beijing right now, as you know, with the president for the opening ceremonies of the Olympics. So he reached this agreement. They blew up the cooling tower on worldwide television. But, and as you alluded to this, the North Koreans have not carried out the next part of the agreement. And time is ticking very fast. They're less than 90 days to the election. Could you explain to everyone exactly what it is the Koreans are supposed to do next as the quid for which they would get removed from the terrorist list, so that everyone understands where we are, because this issue is either going to get settled this year or it'll land right on the next president's desk when whoever it is will have higher priorities and more urgent issues.
Well, on the business, it's hard to be absolutely certain what happened. I think in terms of the change, I think for one thing, President Bush is kind of always had this split personality when it comes to North Korea. I talk about it in the book, between his heart and his head. His heart, he hates these guys. They're horrible. He wants to whack them. He loathes them. They're disgusting. It offends every fiber in his body. His head tells him, can't really do that. And his signals that come out as a result are kind of mixed. And as a result, various people at various points in the administration have all assumed the president was on their side. I think that the combination of the previous policy not working, of Hill's advocacy, of the Chinese, with whom the president has had some close dealings, with the fact that for all of his instinctive "we hate him," he's not ever totally ruled out the other side. All played a role. Unfortunately, Rice wouldn't talk to me. I tried repeatedly, so I couldn't get her own version. But my understanding is that when she came in as Secretary of State, she had the ability to address things that she couldn't in the previous position. And I think it was pretty self-evident that this was a non-starter, and the neocons were leading them down a one-way street. And then Hill was able to produce some results, and I think he was able to convince her, and she was able to convince him. And the other thing here is, I think I referred to before, if you look at the rest of their foreign policy legacy, it's not exactly impressive. Particularly by the fall of 2006, you have Iraq, the American public repudiating the war in Iraq. Iraq is a total mess. Afghanistan is a mess. Middle East is generally a mess. And that cuts to the heart of another question. After the election, I think the Rumsfeld resigned, Cheney was weakened, the Scooter Libby trial weakened Cheney, all these other domestic factors. And in that context, something that could be presented as an achievement that could be spun as multilateral, and they keep this mantra even today, that everything we've achieved is because of multilateral pressure. The president yesterday made this statement saying, because of this six-party multilateral pressure, that's why the North Koreans have agreed to do this. Well, that's, I think, flat wrong. I think the North Koreans agreed to do this because they finally got senior American official Christopher Hill to talk to them one-on-one and address what they were concerned about. And he talked to them not just in Beijing under the aegis of the Chinese, but he talked to them in Berlin and in Singapore and various other places. And that gave the North Koreans a good deal of what mattered to them, and in return, they've been willing to give something. But some of these things will have to wait for people to write their memoirs when they leave office to really figure it out. But I think you had the eclipse of the hardliners at the same time that it became glaringly evident that policy was a total failure on North Korea. And then people describe Hill as the Energizer Bunny, never let up. He pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed. So all of those, and I'm not exactly sure I have exactly the right proportions, but all of those played together. As to where we are now, the issue is this business of verification. Now, I think I have to go back and look at the document. Lee, you correct me on this, but the document doesn't say anything about verification. It says they have to give the declaration, and once the declaration has been given and accepted by the 6 parties, they have to be taken off the list. The verification is a new additional requirement that the U.S. has put in, not the first one. They put in last year that the North Koreans had to talk about proliferation in Syria, which was not on the original deal. And it is not inconceivable. The North Koreans are balking at verification, and particularly this issue of what people can bring in, what instruments to take what measurements. And it is not inconceivable that the North Koreans, if they are not in fact removed from the terrorism list next week, will say, we didn't sign a document that said we have to agree to your terms on verification. We signed a document that said once you accept our list, you have to take us off the terrorism list, so you better do it or else.
But that's not, I don't think that's going to happen. The president is not going to remove
That's right, which means
the terrorism list next week.
That's right, and
some additional movement by Pyongyang.
That's right. So
what is it that
well, we've got
understand needs to be done?
Well, they've got to find out a way. Yes,
Susan Shirk, you want to jump in?
But I think the reason that they moved to stressing verification. Susan Shirk, I'm a professor at UC San Diego. The reason that they moved to verification is because the declaration was inadequate.
Right.
You know, and that, of course, was a fuzziness in the original agreement. I mean, just any North Korean piece of paper was never going to be enough. So if they had a declaration which covered all 3 elements and was more specific, then the whole verification part probably would have been a follow-on issue, not part of this current negotiation. But I think Hill sort of trying to go where he thought he might get progress when he was dissatisfied, everybody was dissatisfied with the declaration, felt that, okay, then I can substitute a verification process agreement on that for the...
But he's come under a tremendous amount of criticism. He's got people in Congress, and
Right.
he doesn't have a lot of friends, partly because he's been a lone ranger.
Right.
There are a lot of people who'd like to see him fail. And you're right, the declaration has a lot of holes in it. And the question is, what do you do? And I can see the logic of pushing for verification. On the other hand, if doing that unravels the whole thing, then this is the problem.
We're running low on time.
Just to clarify, what is meant in this context by verification?
I think what they're talking about at a minimum is when the North Koreans say they have so much plutonium and this to be able to go in and actually take all the points in the 60-page declaration, which they have not made public even though it's not classified. So nobody really knows exactly what's in the declaration, which makes talking about it difficult. To be able to have the U.S. go in and independently verify that what the North Koreans said in this declaration is in fact true. You were about to say something, Lee.
Yeah. In general, first of all, the North has now agreed to principles on verification, which was to be something in the 3rd phase. So partly they've moved forward. What the current issue is we have put a protocol down which specifically talks about being able to do 4 things at Yongbyon that the North hasn't yet agreed to. One is to have access to everything at Yongbyon. In particular, the issue is the waste sites, and there was another facility that we haven't been able to have access to at Yongbyon. That is essential because Yongbyon is the only place where plutonium is being made, and we need to know how much plutonium was made as best we can. We're never going to know with absolute certainty. So verification is about bounding our uncertainty to below a bomb's worth. All right? If we know that the North Korean declaration of 37 kilograms is a kilogram off, that's not a problem. But if it's 7 kilograms off, that's a big problem. That's not a verifiable agreement at that point. So one thing is we need access to every place. Second, we need to take samples, because those samples tell us, by rubbing a glove on a spot, you can tell, you can pick up particles which may be able to tell you how much plutonium was being made. The third thing is we need to be able to bring instruments in.
Right, to do that.
Okay? So it's access to everything, it's instruments. A fourth thing, which is not a big issue, because the North Koreans, I think, are willing to do it, is the role of the IAEA in doing some of these activities. Clearly, the main role is going to be played by the 6 parties, and particularly because it's the 6 parties they're the only ones who can reciprocate for verification. And IAEA can't give the North Koreans anything they want. So those are the 4 issues. But the big issue for North Korea, which everybody seems to be forgetting, is the North Koreans are actually doing things that they weren't supposed to have to do at this phase. They've been accommodating so far, and there are signs they're willing to be accommodating, but the key thing they're insisting on is, as a matter of sovereignty, it is one thing for only North Korea to suffer inspections, and quite another thing that, in their view, this is about the denuclearization of the Korean peninsula, not of North Korea, but of the Korean peninsula. And so they want the right, not necessarily to exercise the right, but they want the right to inspect in the South, because that protection gives them a kind of, if you will, an ideological basis for accepting inspections in the North. And I think that's where the issue is, because the South Korea is resistant to that, even though I would remind everybody that in 1992 the North and South agreed to mutual inspections in a denuclearization accord. So that's the current state of play. Is this fixable? Yes. But it may not be fixable by August 11th. And the U.S. position is not that we won't delist the North. It is that we will delay delisting the North. Because as a legal matter, you can't suddenly go back to Congress and say, oops, they really are terrorists, because, of course, they're not.
So you can see that there are ingredients for a compromise, assuming that you don't have the atmosphere further soured by some angry North Korean pushback right away. But if it doesn't get resolved by the 11th, they're going to have to keep negotiating. And then there is the issue of how long it will take to negotiate, and how close to the election does it make any sense for this administration to do it.
My own guess is, if it's strictly about Yongbyon, this is doable, though maybe not by the 11th. What seems to be the case, however, is if you listen to Doug Wilder, his version is that this involves inspections beyond Yongbyon to get at enrichment in Syria. If it does, that's a non-starter. Right. We're going to have to back off.
Yeah, we've heard some statements that have linked the issue of verification to the North Koreans coming clean on Syria and on uranium. And if that does in fact mean they're going to have to, the U.S. is going to demand they do that simultaneously rather than working the issue out later, we could really be back at a kind of deadlock again.
Well, we could go on, I think, the rest of the afternoon. Unfortunately, it's about time to wind things up. I know there's still a lot of questions out there. One thing you can all do is go buy a book, and as Mike is signing it, you can ask him your question. But let's all thank Mike Chinoy for coming today and sharing all his insights.